Hello everyone, it's been a while since my last video. I've been doing a bit of chess study and I actually decided to enter into a tournament. This tournament was the 2024 Doeberl Cup, which is held in Australia, in Canberra, the capital city. This tournament was the Premier tournament, so it was the hardest tournament of the lot. Now my rating was around 1900 and my starting ranking I was in number 69 out of 83 people. So I'll just share with you guys how I went in this tournament. This is round one. I am white against Prasad, who is my opponent as black. So let's see how I went against him in my first round. Now I haven't played a tournament for many years, so I was a little bit nervous. So this game starts off a little bit shaky. Let's see how we go. So I played e4 and my opponent played the Sicilian defense. So I'll go into a few moves here. So my opponent played the e6 variation, which is looking at, I guess, taking some control of the center. So I played c4 to clamp down on the d5 square. Knight c3, d4. So take captures, and I'm trying to restrict the d5 move. My knight's going to come to c3. My bishop will probably come to e2 and I can castle, and I'm trying to just take the center and hold my opponent back. Knight f6, knight c3. So you can see my opponent has two pieces on the d5, and then if he pushes d5 he'll have a queen as well. And I've also got three pieces on d5, so it's a battle for this d5 square at the moment. So bishop b4 pins the knight, which was one of the defenders of these squares. So increasing the pressure on d5. Now I want to develop my bishop out. That's probably a really good square for it. So if I can push e5, I've got some scope for it down on the king side. Problem is I can't play bishop d3 because my knight will be taken. So I have to exchange knights first and then play bishop d3. Now I've helped my opponent's pawn structure a bit because he's got an extra pawn in the center now. But the trade-off is I get my bishop to a good square and I get to castle quickly. So my opponent now decides to not push the d5 square, but to change tactic and go for the putting his pawns on dark squares and potentially looking at this square for himself. Because now my pawns have gone up 2. He doesn't have. I can't chase any piece away with a pawn anymore. So this is like a weakness on my behalf. So I've castled. I don't mind if my opponent captures my knight because then I capture back, and with a pawn here, I'm covering that central square with a pawn, so that makes it hard to get a piece there. So it sort of undoes my weakness. It does create another weakness because then I have doubled pawns, but because they're not on an open file, because he's got this pawn here, it's very hard for him to get a rook to attack my doubled pawns. So they are safe even though they're slightly weak. My opponent castles. Bring my queen out. I haven't decided where I want to put my dark squared bishop yet. So my opponent moves the dark squared bishop and I decide, well, this bishop's moved 1 and 2, it's moved twice, so if I challenge it, if it takes my bishop, he's made 3 moves with 1 piece. And if he takes me and I take with the queen, I've got all 3 pieces out already, while my opponent still has the queen and bishop behind. So it gives me a bit of a lead in development. My opponent played queen e7 defending the bishop, so rather than moving it again, he developed a piece. I decided to attack down the d file. So this pawn here would be considered a weak pawn because it's behind the 2 other pawns next to it. So if you can attack weak pawns with your rooks, that's always good to put pressure on your opponent. Now my opponent played d6, which I thought was weird. You'll understand the move later. You can see he sort of out-prepared me, but I saw this move and thought, that doesn't make sense. I can take the bishop, double the pawns, and then I've got a weak pawn here to attack. For example, knight a4, threatening the pawn, queen e3, threatening the pawn. You'll see that's my strategy, but I missed a simple defense by my opponent. So you can see, continuing my plan, attacking the weak point. He doesn't have a dark squared bishop, so I was assuming he'd bring the knight back, he'd go on the defensive, I could bring my queen up, I could double rooks on the d file, move my bishop back, and I'd have dominance in the center. I'd be attacking everywhere, he'd be defending. But I missed rook to d8 at the time. As I said, this is my first tournament game. I was a little bit nervous. I thought, why did he play that? And then I played queen here, thinking, okay, I've got 2 pieces attacking, so now knight goes back to defend. And I missed a very simple rook to d4, cutting off my queen's access to that pawn. So yeah, first game jitters, I'm going to put that down to. Now I can't move the bishop because my pawn's attacked by 2 pieces, so I thought I'll just defend up my center, keep it strong, and my goal was to retreat the bishop and potentially exchange off the active rook. I know it does undouble his pawns, but I feel like I'm already sort of in a slightly worse position because this rook is in a really strong position, and it's very hard to chase away. My opponent developed a piece with an attack, which is always a good thing to do. You want to try and develop with an attack. Now, I probably should just go here and defend. I must admit, I'm not the best at defending. I'd rather play actively and give up a pawn. So I decided, let's be a bit creative. Let's just move the bishop back. Now, the computer doesn't like it, and to be honest, it's not correct chess. However, that's something I have to work on. That's my play style. I'd rather give up a pawn, let him take it, and now I've got some play. If you look at my next move, I've got some play against his 2 weak pawns. So this rook here is attacking this pawn and this pawn. So yes, I'm down a pawn, but now my strategy of putting the knight here, putting the queen here, and a rook here, you can see it makes sense. So I like to have a logical plan, and even though I give up a pawn, I'd rather give up a pawn to have an easy to find plan. So now, as I said before, this is what I wanted him to go on the defensive. So my original plan didn't include losing a pawn for this to happen, but sometimes you've got to give to get. So now I double up. So now all my pieces are attacking his weaknesses, and I felt that even though I'm a pawn down, if I do manage to win this pawn, I'm back to even. And you can imagine that once the knights get exchanged or my knights moves, now my rooks are also attacking this pawn. So if I do manage to win my pawn back, I technically will be feeling like I've got a little bit of an advantage because I'll have pressure on the next pawn. Whereas my 2 pawns here are well defended. So I feel like I'm slightly behind, but not too far. All right, so rook check. Now I can't take the rook because if the queen takes, my king has to step up, and then I lose this rook with check. So I lose a rook. So the only option I've got is to move the king out, and then he played rook d3. So the rook's really dominant in my position. I've got no choice but to move my queen somewhere. I don't want to move it over here because it can get attacked and it gets pushed away. It'll get pushed backwards or something, and it gets pushed away from the center where I feel like I need defense. So I just played queen back 1, maintaining defense along this rank and keeping the queen near my king in case of things like check. I move my king back. I've got a queen here to cover my king. So he develops his last piece. This makes sense. Now I would like to take this pawn. What I did play was h3 to give my king some sort of like escape square for later. Taking that pawn is not a good idea, even though it looks like, yeah, I won my free pawn back. But you'll see that now my queen gets lost because my king's in the way. So I wanted to play h3 first to get my king to safety, down to there and then down to there, and then I threatened to take the pawn. So I'm still a few moves away from reaching my strategy. h3. Now, my opponent obviously saw my plan to evacuate the king and then take the pawn, maintaining equality and maybe even giving myself a slight advantage. So he decided to give the pawn back. Now, that's a very clever move from my opponent. He's giving back the pawn on his terms. Notice that I can't take the pawn with my rook, which is what I want to do to keep my pressure on the next pawn. But if I take the pawn with my rook, then rook comes here and traps my queen again. So I have to take with a pawn, and now this is considered a mistake. At the time, I was considering another move, which was knight to b2, giving up another pawn. Well, not giving up a pawn, but not taking the pawn. But I was worried about a move like pawn takes pawn, Actually, this is not a good move. Oh yeah, because I was thinking take, 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 and I thought c5 or something like this. And I thought my opponent has an extra pawn. I can't take with a knight because it gets pinned. I can't take with a rook because then I lose an exchange. Next move, my opponent's going to probably play a rook over, and then he's got an extra pawn. This pawn's a pass pawn. In fact, the computer, when I looked at this later, gives this as equal. At the time, I couldn't assess this as equal. I assessed this as myself being in a lot of trouble. The computer doesn't think it's a problem and thinks that I can hold this position. However, I'm not as good as the computer, clearly. So let's go back. So I took the pawn, even though it blocks my rooks and hurts my position. I decided in the time that it's better to get the material back and then try and deal with the problems later. I realised I can get my knight back, attack his rook. His rook has to move, I can threaten the queen. Queen might have to move, for example. Then the knight can come to here, then the knight can come to here, defended by the pawn. So I thought I have a plan to reroute my knight to the centre, and if I can get my knight from here to here to here, supported by the pawn, that blocks the d file and I should have no problem. However, I decided to get my king away first, which is probably not the best move. It allows the queen to switch over to the king side and look at these dark squares. It's targeting all these squares. It would have probably been better in hindsight to move the knight there first and chase away the rook before moving the king, because he gains a vital move having the queen there, because instead of moving the rook back, he gets to move the rook down. At the moment, if he moves the rook down, looks like I can take the rook and then probably play a rook here. And so he can't really move the queen back. Well, he can, but if he moves it back here, let's just move it. It ends up with like a mass exchange. And notice how I have the extra pawn in this situation as before, and this should be defendable, this position. With queens on and with material back to even, I would be happy with this. So a better move would have been to push the knight back straight away. Anyway, it's easy to tell in hindsight. So queen there, threatening to come in here. So I bring the knight back to defend. The rook comes down. Notice that if the queen comes here, he's going to have a checkmate threat. So I move the queen back. And then the knight, the reason I brought the knight here is to be able to block along the second rank and cover the dark squares. Whoops. So now he brings another piece into the attack, threatening the knight up, which will put pressure on here. We'll see. So I took the rook, which in this up to here, the computer assesses me as almost losing, but it's technically still holdable. But one single mistake pushes me into lost, and this is considered a mistake. I thought, again, like I said before, I don't like defending. I thought of a way to give up a pawn. I decided to push this pawn, cut the connection between the queen and the rook, thinking I'll give up a pawn, but I'll get rid of the pressure on my position and see if I can defend the ending. However, in this case, because knight takes, I can't actually take the rook because that's still checkmate. So I have to take the knight, queen takes, defending the rook. I want to try and exchange rooks off, which is trying to get to a queen ending. If I have queen and queen and a bunch of pawns, maybe I can try and sneak my queen in, go for checks, stir up trouble. I think in my position I'm already losing because I am down a pawn. But when you're down, sometimes you got to try and create trouble for your opponent. So I took the rook and started pushing out my pawn. Now again, computer doesn't like it. I'm not trying to play perfect chess. I'm lost anyway, according to the computer. I'm just trying to cause trouble. So I push the pawn again, and then I take that, trying to open the king up. Now unfortunately, because my opponent has a pawn that's so far advanced, and his queen's pretty much in the center, controlling a lot of important squares, cutting my king off, it makes it hard for me to do any checks or anything. There's nowhere I can check, there's nothing I can really do. So I have to just play passively with my queen. My opponent plays a pawn move to try and give his king some escape squares. He can go here to here, for example, and there's no more checks. So he's a very experienced player. I push my pawn up, you know, just hoping for the best. Check, check, something like that. See what happens. He checks a few times, takes a pawn with check, checks. I managed to get this dangerous pawn. I'm only a pawn down, but it comes at the cost of having to exchange queens. With my queen coming off, there's no way I can really get a draw. A few checks to gain some time on the clock, and we reach this position. Now, I'm only down one pawn, and it seems like I've done well to defend, but unfortunately this pawn, if this pawn was over here, this would probably be a draw. But because the pawn's on its own square and it can run down the bottom, this is a passed pawn, my king has to run over here and defend the pawn, and then I'll have two pawns against one, and my opponent, as you'll see, he's very, very skilled at the ending, and you'll see how he finishes the game off. So he gets his king to an active square, I push my pawn, there's not much I can do at this point, and then he gets his king up, pushes the pawn. See how this pawn covers that square, this pawn covers those squares, the king covers that square. My king can't use any of these squares, so I have to go backwards. So a good thing to remember. So I try to waste some time. He moves the king, I waste more time. It's a question mark, but it's lost anyway. And then I go back, and then he comes in with his king, and then he's going to win the second pawn. Checks me, I have to go back, takes the second pawn, and it's all over. I decided it's double question mark, but I decided I've had enough. I'll let my opponent have a nice win and checkmate me, nice and easy. And that's the end of that game. Hope you guys liked it, and if you want to see me online, I'm on chess.com, Raptor 2025. I'll leave a description down below if you want to add me and play some games. Always willing to learn more and keep trying to improve myself. See you guys next time.